Production funding for Behind the Headlines is made possible in part by the WKNO Production Fund, the WKNO Endowment Fund, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
Redevelopment around the U of M, the marijuana ordinance, and much more tonight on Behind the Headlines. I'm Eric Barnes, publisher of the Memphis Daily News. Thanks for joining us. I'm joined tonight by Martavius Jones from the Memphis City Council. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Along with Burnell Smith, publisher of the new Tri-State Defender. Thanks for being here again.
Thank you.
So we're doing part news roundtable, part what's going on at City Council. For you, the marijuana ordinance, what is your take on that? We talked about it a couple of weeks ago. Do you want to see it get passed? Do you want to see more study on it? We had the district attorney come out this week, very much opposed. The new police director, Rawlings, former interim director, not real happy about it. But what is your take on it?
Well, as a co-sponsor of it, I'm in favor of it passing. Coming out of committee this week, I was a little bit more optimistic of its chances of passing versus a couple of weeks ago when it was first introduced in committee. So I'm pleased with the first reading. I think that when we look at the societal cost of having it in its current form right now, the decriminalization of it, I think, is going to make a difference going forward.
Well, two of the objections raised. One is that I think it was Rawlings at various points has said that it seems to encourage, it sends the wrong message that we as a city government don't care about smoking marijuana, which is on a federal level and on a state level illegal. What's your response to that messaging that an ordinance like this might make?
For people who are not marijuana users, this is not going to influence them to do so. I don't think so. And I think we have to have a common sense approach to it as well. I don't think that anybody is going to take a sip of alcohol before they go before a job interview. And the same thing should apply to marijuana use. But we're talking about people who in the past, if they've been arrested for any possession for for a little bit less than half an ounce, on numerous occasions, they could be listed as felons.
Yeah, I'll go to Burnell and say, but Amy Wyrick, the district attorney, came out very much opposed to it, but in part said that it's something like 300 cases or less, a very small number from her point of view, would involve somebody just with possession of marijuana of this amount, that it's primarily the marijuana and they have a gun, or it's the marijuana and it's part of a medley of charges. What was your response to her bringing that up?
There was a question that was asked to bring back before council when we talk about some other types of charges with that. So that was just the possession, because I want to say that there was an additional penalty if you had the paraphernalia, and that may have aggravated the charges. So when you put the two together, once we talk about the marijuana in addition to the paraphernalia, if those are the only two charges, we could be looking at more than 300. We don't know what that number is, so that's some of the information that's going to come back.
Burnell, questions or comments on it?
Well, I just think it's a common sense move, particularly relative to our demographic, both from a race standpoint as well as from a poverty standpoint. And if you look at the numbers, African Americans particularly over-index relative to criminalization because of very small amounts of marijuana. And that's not just a Memphis thing. I think it's a national issue that's being dealt with in various ways. And in my estimation, I think, although there may be, the district attorney may have some valid points relative to those small number of cases, but I think overall, relative to how the police deals with those types of arrests, one is we free up a less than full complement of officers from having to arrest and go through all the time and energy to go through those processes when they come across those cases. Then they don't have to go to the courts as well. So, I think it will ultimately be a cost-saving measure for the city, and I think it also will allow individuals who otherwise would find themselves wrapped in the criminal justice system not having to deal with those kinds of issues.
And do you see, I guess I'll ask you, but I want Burnell's thoughts too. Is it in part that maybe it's a small number of cases, but it's kind of a first step because there's a whole conversation, we've had it on the show, it's going on nationally, about changing some of these guidelines, justice reform, particularly for smaller offenses, misdemeanors and lighter, broken tail lights, or that as various people, Harold Collins really was on the show some months ago talking about this, how these small offenses, get people introduced to the criminal justice system, and fines of some hundreds of dollars that might, to many people, sound like a small number, are in fact really large,
Right.
and they pile up. So in some ways, do you see this being really not just an ordinance about marijuana, but the starting point for sentencing reform and a new approach to these kind of offenses?
I think it is, because when we look at the number of arrests that have taken place, and any type of situation that could escalate. So we talk about a broken tailpipe when somebody may have had marijuana in their car, even if we're talking about an amount less than half an ounce. How many instances have there been an escalation of events? Somebody has a broken tail light. Oh, I'm in fear because I do have this marijuana in here. I just think about all of the confrontations or interactions with law enforcement that could be de-escalated when we're talking about less of a severe penalty if somebody's in possession of it.
Segue in a little bit and talk about police. Your thoughts on Director Rawlings getting the position? I mean, it didn't go before council, but just your thoughts on him being named permanent director or official director.
Very, very pleased. I think that he had the bridge incident was the ultimate job interview. I felt that had we had somebody from the outside, I don't think that we would have had the same outcome on the bridge. It really took somebody who knows Memphis, who has a sense and a feel for this community, to come to that type of resolution.
Yeah, and you said you were on the show with, and I can't remember who else, early in the year, I think right after you'd been elected, we were talking about priorities and direction and so on. And one thing you said that is counter to what a lot of politicians are saying right now, and a lot of what's in the media, that Memphis police complement went from around 2,500 officers to just around 2,000. Mayor Strickland and other city council people have made it a priority to get that number back up. You said, I'm not sure we need that many. Is that, now that you've been in, 9 months now, what is your take on that and the proper number of police that we need out there?
Well, one of the conversations that's taking place as well is if we're talking about, and this sort of goes into another area,
Sure.
If we talk about the de-annexation,
do
we really, if there are areas that will be de-annexed, will we need that complement of officers here? And I still go back and look. Let's look at a long-term solution. When we talk about an average police salary, when we're talking about benefits salaries, we're talking about $50,000 plus per officer.
Right.
When we talk about revenue shortages and revenue challenges that we have to grow this city, can we really afford it?
Yeah. Well, your thoughts, Burnell, I mean, on this whole issue of, Strickland's been in 9 months. He's made a huge priority. He ran on a real law and order agenda message. He's made a priority of adding police officers. But is that the right direction, do you think? Or your readers?
I think particularly now that you have Rawlings, I think which was a smart and strategic hire. Definitely he showed his ability to really understand the community that he's serving, that's being, in most instances, most impacted by law enforcement. So, I think he has to give Rawlings a chance to sort of implement his idea of community policing, and work with the complement of officers that are there. I think Martavius' point about the potential impact of de-annexation and shrinking the city is a real issue. And so, to sort of staff up police for a city that's going to, for a less area, I don't think it really makes sense.
And do you think, and I should say, we invited, just the timing was such that we're happy you're here. We had invited some other city council people, they couldn't be here, so it's just out of fairness, I should explain that to the viewers. De-annexation, I did want to come back to that. Do you think that de-annexation of a size and scale is on the table, that it would really dramatically impact the area that Memphis Police had to cover? I mean, the revenue they were getting, because for people who don't remember, I mean, in the spring, the legislature came forward with a really heavy-handed, broad-based de-annexation bill that would, for the Strickland administration, not everyone agrees with this, some $100 million, I can't even remember the number of people. It was a huge impact on revenue and so on in the city. There's been discussion that maybe just targeted de-annexation of certain areas could happen. We've talked about that on the show, and we'll probably do another show on it soon. What's your sense of that? I mean, are we really talking about possible de-annexation of enough people in enough area that it would have a big impact on the number of police needed?
I think it would have. I don't think that number or the complement of officers that will be impacted has been identified just as of yet. But there's still something to take into consideration, and it depends upon if it's the South Cordova area, if it's the South Wind. You know, we talk about those communities in general, but I think when we talk about South Wind, it could very well include Windike and some other areas that would go into unincorporated Shelby County. And one of the impacts that we talk about, Memphis would have no control over this. As Memphis de-annexes, that becomes the responsibility of Shelby County government. Memphians still pay Shelby County taxes, so we wouldn't necessarily have a decrease in our city taxes, but we can have an increase in our Shelby County taxes in order to absorb this additional cost of officers.
Would you like to see, I mean, if you had a vote, and I guess it will come to you guys to some degree, some areas de-annexed?
Absolutely not.
Not?
No.
Because why?
Because when we look at what has fueled the growth of all of Shelby County has been the Memphis Light, Gas, and Water division of the city of Memphis. Without the infrastructure that MLG&W has provided to these areas, you couldn't have had any of this growth. And somebody, you know, the argument has been made, well, I pay my utility bill. But when you talk about the infrastructure cost of a subdivision of that part of the city, it takes MLG&W 30 years to recoup those costs. A $6,000 utility bill per year, you're talking about 30 years in order for MLG&W or the city of Memphis to recoup those costs.
What else are you hearing about de-annexation? Anything? I mean, there have been some people up there talking with legislators. There's a lot going on sort of behind the scenes to try and have a negotiated, you know, targeted de-annexation. But what do you hear?
Well, I mean, I just think given the makeup of our legislative body in Nashville, that there's a real possibility that they can push something through that would have really, really negative effects on the city of Memphis in particular. And I think it just makes sense to negotiate a deal that we control, particularly the city council can make a decision to claw back some areas, if you will, rather than allowing something that similarly happened with the schools. You know, if Martavis will remember when Senator Mark Norris and Kurt Todd went up and created that bill and the impact that it had on our local community from Nashville. I would think it makes much more sense for us to take control of that discussion and that process here on a local basis rather than dealing with something heavy-handed coming from Nashville.
Yeah. Well, let's kind of move on a little bit. I mentioned at the top of the show, but it's coming through City Council. There's a lot going on at City Council right now. Is the University of Memphis redevelopment. We've talked about Highland Row and Highland Strip and lots of things going on there. But now there's a proposal for a TIF, a tax increment financing district, which would, in short, it has to be approved by the state, but it would help fund redevelopment there. What were your thoughts? David Rudd the mayor actually came down to council and made kind of a rare appearance in a committee. Your thoughts on this TIF district for the U of M?
The fact that we're using TIFs in order to spur economic growth is very pleasing to me. I lived in Nashville from 93 to 99. And so I was there before the current boom that they have right now. But that has been the main economic driver when you talk about incentives for business as opposed to pilots. Pilots, you're essentially saying you may collect $50,000 in property taxes, but you're okay with collecting just 10. When you talk about a TIF, you still set that baseline at $50,000. Anything above that can go to revitalizing, but you're not sacrificing revenue, which I think is the biggest knock on pilots. You can use both, but Memphis has relied upon pilots to do so. Nashville has relied upon TIFs, and I think that way you still set a foundation as far as what your revenues will be.
And what they're talking about is the University Neighborhood Development Corporation, the money would go through EDGE, which also administers the pilots, about $19 million over 20 years. They think new and existing tax revenue, $83 million over 20 years. And again, 19 of that would go towards improvement from Cityscape and so on. There's a lot going on over there right now anyway, but your thoughts on this TIF, I mean, and why they aren't used more commonly in Memphis?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think we hear a lot more of that. I mean, we heard about it when we were talking about redeveloping in the Coliseum area, which I think we'll probably be talking about
Yes,
here at some
absolutely.
point. And we talked about it in a number of areas, including Overton, the Overton Square district, and a number of areas. But I think it's a smart way to really to grow and to encourage developers to really utilize the revenue that'll come from sales and other
Right.
things there to really push that, rather than what we've always used, which is the pilot
Yeah.
program, and sometimes we don't get the job growth that's projected. Sometimes those projects don't work out,
Right.
and so with a TIF project, the city or the taxpayers don't end up necessarily footing the bill if a project doesn't work out.
Yeah, and I should say, so it's sales taxes that would otherwise go, the majority of the sales tax, the 9.5, 9.25, I try to ignore how much we pay in sales tax, but it's a lot.
But we don't have an income tax.
Yeah, we don't have an income tax. Sure. Most of it goes to the state and stays there. The tax increment allows, if it's approved by the state, it allows the local community to keep a
it.
bigger share of that, as long as they're investing in something, with the idea being that that everyone will benefit because of all that investment there. The Coliseum, you all you'd approved the Wiseacre Brewery plan, but there was kind of a 2-week period in which other people could bring forward ideas. None of them apparently struck a chord. And so now Wiseacre officially has its, 180 day?
180 day window.
180 day
yes.
window. Your thoughts on that, and were you disappointed that there weren't other proposals put forward? Brian Salisbury from DSG came with a revised proposal, but it really didn't seem to catch on. Your thoughts on where we're going with the Coliseum?
Well, I thought that there would have been many more takers, well, not necessarily many more, but more than just 1 or 2 proposals for the Coliseum.
Yeah.
When the non-compete provisions of the agreement between Hoops and the city of the county,
Which is the Grizzlies and the FedEx Forum
Correct.
having really a lot of control over what sort of events and concerts and so on can go on here. They have to go through the FedEx Forum in most cases.
Correct.
Okay, so go ahead.
But when you look at that particular agreement, as far as the city and the county being involved with any type of improvements, operating that on an ongoing basis, it presented its challenges. The Coliseum, as a lot of us have a lot of memories about what has taken place over there, the years, the Beatles, Elvis. I can remember seeing Prince at the Mid-South Coliseum. But as far as operating that venue, and me for one, I would love to see events stay in Memphis as opposed to going to the Landers Center.
Yeah,
but just
down in DeSoto County.
operationally, and the cost of bringing it up to ADA compliance, that presented its challenge to anybody coming in.
And there's no desire among you or your city council members to, it's an interesting idea. You guys want to get rid of it. You really want someone else to take care of it. You don't want to get into the event management business. You even, I think it would said, if Brian Salisbury was willing to write a check for $25 million, someone on the council said, we might take that. We could sell the thing. I guess at the end of the 180 days if the brewery doesn't work out. So you really don't, would you just like it to go away on some level and have somebody else take care of it, or?
Well, I would like for us to have some type of facility for concerts, event venues. Right. I would like to have that. But as far as being able for the city to operate a new one or the current one, the expense that would be associated with bringing it up to ADA compliance, I think that there are other priorities for the city that go ahead of that when we have a facility in the FedEx Forum.
Yeah, your thoughts on Coliseum, where we are? We talked a couple weeks ago that it looked like the Wiseacre Brewery would be the choice it is now. What are you hearing about the Coliseum?
Yeah, I think the verdict's out amongst the public about whether that's the best and the highest and best use in terms of having a brewery there, and some of the other things that they're talking about doing in terms of ancillary businesses that they would lease to. But talking to some of the city's renowned promoters, people like Fred Jones, who said, it needs to be an event venue, and I know he does tons of events, including several that are going to be down at the Landers Center. And so, when you look at the hemorrhage of resources that go, not only those that just buy tickets and parking and all that to go down there, but then those that buy drinks and food and stuff before and after events. I think there's a real financial impact that the city has to look at, and I think it's a real opportunity for a private-public partnership to redevelop not just the Coliseum, but really that whole area, there that impacts the Orange Mound community and Bethel Grove and a lot of those neighborhoods around there. I just think that there has to be some, you got to really look at that again and determine, how to make it a win for the city. Not that they necessarily get back into the event facility management, but that you find some strategic partners with the wherewithal and the creativity to really make it work.
And yet, again, there really were only two remotely kind of serious proposals, the Wiseacre proposal and the DSG Brent Salisbury proposal, which was revised in the second round. So there isn't this appetite, for people to get in there and get into this event business. Because I guess, and we talked about it, I think, a couple weeks ago when you were on the show, there's some real skepticism that very many of those shows would come back from the Landers Center in DeSoto County to the Coliseum, even if it were paid for, pristine, and ready to roll.
And I think one of the things is people are scared of that agreement with the Grizzlies. I mean, I think that, they feel like, we might have this great facility and legally not be able to use it. And so, I don't know if there's an opportunity for renegotiation on that or restructure on that. I mean, I think all parties should be willing to come to the table to do what's in the best interest of the city as a whole, and hopefully, that may happen somewhere down the road.
And you talk about the whole neighborhood. It's interesting to watch what's going on with the Friends of the Fairgrounds people we've had, Marvin Stockwell, who's involved with that, and some of the other people who do want to. They're talking to the city council there. They're talking to the neighborhood groups. They're talking and trying to have this whole plan for what is really a tremendous amount of park space and green space. I mean, we get real focused on the Coliseum because it's iconic and it's big and for good reason. But there's a tremendous opportunities around there to link to the Tiger Lane, to Maxine Smith, to Kroc Center and so on. I mean, your thoughts on, separate from the Coliseum, what should happen with that whole fairground space?
Well, one of the things that I thought about during this discussion, and I think one of the Kojic bishops talked about Memphis perhaps being involved in bringing back the Kojic Convention here. And as I looked at the non-compete clause, it talked about a facility between 5,000 and 50,000. And I couple this with the discussion about Memphis going into the Big 12. Perhaps if there could have been a project to build a stadium larger than that, Memphis is not, or Memphis nor the county is prohibited from operating something that's larger than that. So, if we could have rewound this 4 or 5 years ago, we looked at building a bigger facility. Could that have been more attractive to the Big 12? We would have been able to operate a facility. I don't know whether it's a 50, 60,000 seat dome, whatever the case may have been, that could have lured Kojic back, that could have provided something that's a little bit more attractive to the Big 12.
But is there the money for that?
Well, and that's the main thing.
I mean, it sounds great sitting around this table, but
does.
I mean, if you got to vote for it, I mean, how would the city come up with the money and the support to
I do not vote for it based upon our current.
Yeah, I mean,
maybe the city can hit the Powerball when it gets up to $1 billion. Right.
I mean, because we get back to the whole, Jim Strickland talking about, brilliant at the basics, potholes, police, fire. And the era of the Bass Pros and the big ones, the big projects, he just doesn't see that happening. You as a council member don't see that happening at this point?
I don't see it happening, but one of the things too, and this really has been what I've talked about when I was on the school board, and I talk about this on the council. Memphis continues to pay Shelby County taxes. How much of, and just think about 30 years, if we would have had a larger share of our Shelby County taxes coming back to Memphis. One of a recent discussion that I had with someone, when we talk about MATA and the challenges that it has, where's Shelby County's contribution into MATA? So there are so many things that I still feel that over the years we have not received our commensurate share of what we pay in Shelby County taxes as Memphians.
Yeah.
How do we do that going forward?
Okay. Just a couple minutes left. I was going to ask you about Big 12, your thoughts on it. I mean, it's disappointing. I mean, we don't do sports, but it's a big economic story too, and a kind of a civic story. And, the economic impact of being in the Big 12 would have been huge. Your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I mean, I just, it seems like the University of Memphis is, always a bridesmaid, never the bride, and, in these opportunities. And I'm not sure exactly what it is, but it seems like we're really, really in a tough position relative, the SEC doesn't really fit. You know, some of these other opportunities have not really fit. It's not like we don't have, you know, the financial supporters and backers there, and you know, there were some people who really stepped up and said, hey, we want this. But you know, I just think there's some unique things that some of the other schools presented that we're just not in the position to put on the table at this point.
Yeah, and further thoughts? I mean, could the city have done more? The city council, you guys asked in any way to support or fund or anything the Big 12 did, or did you just watch it from the sidelines?
Well, one of the questions that I asked of Dr. Rudd when he came before council, if this comes about again, what can the city do to put Memphis, University of Memphis, in a better position where we would be a little bit more attractive going forward? He's, you know, his comment was, hey, this and what you're doing right now, it was his opinion that the council, the city has been supportive, but it was just something in me that I thought that we could have done something. Yeah, it may have been too little too late at this point. Yeah. But going forward, I would really want to know, what can we do to make our chances better? Because when I look at how big college athletics have become, particularly football, the television contracts, it would have really been an economic boom to the city of Memphis.
Yeah. And final thought, Southern Heritage Classic this weekend. I mean, this is kind of the vision that people had, was events like that getting even bigger through the Big 12. But anyway, we have that there. Thank you both for being here. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you for joining us. Join us again next week.